Good morning. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology on a Tuesday morning from Lexington, Kentucky. I'm so glad everybody could make it. See Internet Surfer and Charles and Connecticut, Cubanica and Randy. We got Bulgaria. We got Northeast United States. Joseph Kala. The membership's up to almost 70 members now. We have 2 new members in the last couple of days. Rich the Lawn Guy, Transition, Brady, Strapper Man. Good morning to everybody. On Tuesday morning, we go over a video and it's just a comments video. I watch a video and I just comment on it as I play it. If you're new to Turfgrass Epistemology, it's the study of turfgrass knowledge. How do we know what we know about turfgrass science? We normally explore the scientific literature, try to provide some evidence to support our management practices. That's on Monday morning for the members only show at 10 a.m. and Thursday evening for the public at 9 p.m. And then on Tuesday, we do this show. So we are going to... I think it's working. Yeah, we're going to get started. Good morning, Mason. Today's video, we're going over a video on soil testing. And the video, I had several videos lined up, and then this one popped up on my algorithm, and I put it at the front of the list. And then another video popped up, so I'm going to do that one next week, of the same gentleman. And I wanted to go over this one in particular because... from my perspective, I see 2 things in this video. One is a genuine, sincere interest in understanding, and 2, a charlatan and a BS artist providing misinformation. And I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. I'm doing him a service by saying he's misinforming the other gentleman, because if he knows what he's saying is incorrect, then he's disinforming him. In other words, he's lying if he knows the truth. So I'm doing him a service in assuming that he doesn't know actually what's going on, and he's simply spewing BS, which would be misinformation, as opposed to disinformation. Okay. So I'm going to show this video and comment on it as we go. It's only 16 minutes long, but I commented as we go, so who knows how long it'll take. Let's see, get this up here. The video comes from a channel called Ryan Knorr Lawn Care, and the title is Reading My Soil Test Report with John Perry of Lawncology. We're going to play the introduction and get started. Here we go.
All right, well, today I thought we'd take a look at my soil tests that we just did a couple weeks ago here. I have both of them back from a couple different labs, mainly out of just curiosity on seeing what they were going to look like compared to each other. And I have Mr. John Perry joining me today to look over some of these things. So thank you, John.
Oh, I'm just happy to be here, buddy.
So when you get a soil test back...
So if the audio is screwy, let me know. I'll do what I can on my end. It's always a game on my end to try to figure out how the audio sounds coming from somebody else's video. But please let me know in the chat if it's too oversaturated or it's too low. I'll do what I can. So Ryan Knorr, who I don't know, if I recall correctly, and he would know if this is true, when I first started doing YouTube stuff, the first show I was on was the Grass Factor, and I really thought it was creative, and I wanted to do more of that. I thought, well, this is creative. This seems like it's reaching a number of people, and I reached out to a couple other channels. One of them was the, what was the name of the one with Elevated Lawnscapes with Cam and, what's his name, Rob? I'm sorry, I should know their names. I apologize. And I did their show, and I reached out to a couple other ones, and I think, could be wrong, I think I reached out to Ryan Knorr, and he said that's not really what his channel does, and, he was very polite. And I said, okay, cool. And so I kept looking at other opportunities, and that's how eventually I turned into developing my own channel, because I wanted to be a little bit more active in producing, content about turfgrass management in a way that is evidence-based. So I could be wrong, but I think I reached out to Ryan once. I don't know him, but I do like the way he presents his information. He does seem sincere and genuine in his interest of learning what is true. So this is Ryan Knorr, if you don't know who he is. And the other gentleman's name is John Perry. They're going to talk about a soil test. And the question was, what do you first look at in a soil test? Let's see what John Perry has to say.
Let's just kind of start with where you would there's a lot of information on there. There's a lot of stuff on graphs and all that. So it might be a little bit overwhelming. Where would you start to just kind of digest that information?
Okay, so just so we're on the same page, where do I start? Does anybody want to take a guess where I start on a soil test? You guys, a lot of the members are here today. There's some subscribers here as well. Where do you think I would start on a soil test? The first thing that I would do or say to someone who presents me with some data on a soil test report. I'll give you a second or two if you want to reply. But I don't start on the soil test report. I don't start on the numbers. I don't look at the soil test report at all at first. What I want to know is, what does a turf look like? Oh, Dr. Shaddox, can you tell me if I have enough potassium or phosphorus in my soil from my soil test report? Can you tell if my pH is too high or too low? Do I need to apply lime or sulfur? Here's the soil test report. My first question back is, what does your turf look like? Have you had any pre-existing conditions? Are you trying to keep track of something over time? Was your pH 3.5 last year and you had a horrible turf, and now you're applying lime and it's 4.5 this year and the turf is looking better? I mean, those sorts of things. Yeah, bad days. Why do you even need a soil test? That's oftentimes that's my approach. How do you know, excuse me? How do you know you need to actually start chasing these numbers on a soil test? What does your turf look like? That's the question. So the very first thing I ever do is I want photographs or I want confirmation from the end user. What does your turf look like? And whether their turf is acceptable or not is entirely in the eye of the beholder, in the eye of the client. So my front lawn is completely unacceptable to most people. I was working with my neighbor yesterday, and he wants a lawn that looks better than my lawn. And he has a similar situation in terms of his soil. And so my front lawn is not acceptable to him, but it's acceptable to me. So if it's acceptable to me, what does it matter what the soil test report has on it? Doesn't make any difference. Yeah, and John Duncan says, why are you testing? That's the first question. What is your objective? What are you trying to accomplish by soil testing? Because if your turf looks good, and you're going to show, and I'm assuming that the soil test report is from Mr. Knorr's front lawn or his lawn. His lawn's immaculate. I mean, it looks like a golf course. When we rate turf grass on quality from 1 to 9, 9s almost never exist. It's extremely rare. A 9 is a flawless sward. No disease, perfect cut, no weeds, no discoloration. Everything's perfect. Perfect density, perfect color, everything. His lawn is pretty dang close to a 9. So if your lawn looks like that, the argument can be made, well, yes, it looks like that, but I've had a pre-existing condition. That's the reason I asked, do you have any pre-existing conditions? But if you don't have pre-existing conditions and your lawn looks perfect, why are you soil testing? Don't worry about soil tests. Your lawn's great. Okay, don't worry about it. But like I said, if you have numbers you're trying to keep track of over time, then so be it. That's where I go. Let's see what John Perry has to say.
Okay. So I think first of all, it's important to note that your soil test is there to be a roadmap. It should always be considered as a roadmap. You can't always fix everything in a single season, and you need to look at your soil test as basically a multi-year investment into the bank of nutrients in the soil.
I'm not going to beat him over the head on that too much. I mean, that can be true. Yes. I mean, I don't look at it as a roadmap, but if you're looking to manage things over time, you have pre-existing conditions, then you are looking at, what is occurring over several years to see if your management practices are resulting in a more acceptable turf grass. The people who don't understand soil testing, like this gentleman, John, he'll say, well, the numbers are moving up or the numbers are moving down. I don't care about the numbers. That's chasing numbers. Don't chase numbers on a soil test. Chase turf grass. Chase turf grass performance. Chase turf grass quality. And yes, sometimes there's a correlation between the soil test numbers and turf grass quality, of course. But I'm not overly concerned about numbers on a soil test unless you have a problem and we're trying to diagnose it and treat it and so forth. Okay. But for the most part, he's fine with whatever he said there. I don't look at it as a roadmap, but I look at it as if there's a problem and I see something way off, like sulfur's 1 and your turf grass is yellow, then it's not a roadmap, it's a diagnostic tool, is what it is. Right? That's the way I would look at it. Is there something going on in your turf that's unacceptable? And then is there some clarity on a soil test that can help guide you in terms of diagnosing the problem and treating it? That's the way I look at a soil test.
Mm-hmm. So, in my opinion, there's no such thing as a bad soil test.
Well, I don't know what he means by that, but I can show you a really bad soil test. I got a soil test from a friend of mine in Florida who's trying to grow grass on a brownfield, which is an old waste dump. They're trying to grow it on the banks of this brownfield to keep the soil intact, keep it from eroding. He showed me the numbers, and I was like, good God, where is this at? I mean, I've never seen values that far off where sulfur is in the 700 or 800 parts per million, Mehlich 3, and the calcium is 100 parts per million, and the manganese is 1, and the potassium is 5 or whatever. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but it was exceedingly bad. I was like, what is going on? The chances of you growing an acceptable turf grass in that situation are incredibly low. But it's on the edges of a brownfield, the slopes of a waste dump, basically. So their expectations are not Augusta National. They just want it to, root down and hold it there. So their expectations are not very high, but their potential for growing is extremely low. I don't think the potential for growth there is going to meet their expectations. So in that example, that soil test was horrible. I mean, it's awful. So that is, a rare situation, but there's definitely, bad soil tests.
There's just a soil test.
So don't look at it and freak out and think like, oh, there's something majorly wrong here or there or
correct
that type of thing.
Yeah, again, it's meant to be guidelines. So
I don't know what he means by guidelines, but I agree. I wouldn't freak out on a soil test, but when you see yellow turf, and I'll use sulfur as an example, and sulfur is 1 or 2, don't freak out, but just recognize that's very likely what the most limiting factor is, most likely sulfur. So you would adjust your management practices accordingly in that situation where you see an unacceptable turf. Very likely it's a result of low sulfur, and you would either adjust your sulfur up using, potassium sulfate or calcium sulfate or ammonium sulfate or something like that.
So, in the case of the soil test that you sent me, so if we just kind of look at that straight out of the gate, I am going to read straight down without looking at the graphs first. So the graphs are there. They're very helpful. As I've stated before, it's the fastest way to see what a limiting factor is in your soil.
Yeah, I don't find these graphs helpful at all, just so you know. And I'll explain why that is. These graphs are a result of, well, they should be, if they're conducted properly, are a result of proper correlation. In other words, we know how much is in the soil and whether or not that amount is sufficient for turfgrass growth or not. Okay. So the reason I don't have much confidence in these bars at all is because I have a great deal of confidence in my position that these weren't created from a correlation. What is the boron, the correlation between boron and copper and iron and manganese and zinc in the soil of Mehlich 3 to turfgrass quality? What metric did they even use? Did they use turfgrass growth, nitrogen uptake, density, quality? You have to pick a metric to correlate. I would argue that the most likely or most useful variable to correlate with soil test results is turf quality. But an argument can be made for growth rate if you're on sport turf, or if you're on a practice driving range, the tee box of a practice driving range. That might be growth rate that you're looking for, not quality, because you're trying to get that grass to grow as fast as you can. But on a home lawn where you don't have a lot of damage, maybe it's turfgrass quality. Okay, so I don't even know what metric they used. And I'm pretty confident that they didn't even do a correlation with manganese and zinc what is the critical manganese and zinc level in soil for turfgrass quality? I don't know what that is. And I'm pretty confident that they don't know either. So I don't know where they got these values from, these ranges from, very high, good, medium, low, and all these things. They have a bar showing that it's, you're in acceptable ranges or below the acceptable ranges. I don't know. So if I'm not aware of any evidence, then I'm not convinced that I should use them. It's really that simple. That's epistemology. And from a soil test report, as a consumer, I think the average consumer would look at this and go, well, of course this is accurate. Why would they present a bar chart and an interpretation of these values unless they had some sort of, research conducted to determine that it's accurate? Why would they do that? Why would they present this? I don't know the reason. What I do know is I am not aware of any correlation between zinc and iron and copper and boron and even potentially calcium to some degree, and even to some degree magnesium, to a lesser degree magnesium. There's a little bit in the literature on magnesium or boron. I'm not aware of anything in the literature that tells me that I should have a boron level of 1 part per million or whatever. Okay. But the average person probably doesn't bother, or even, they're busy doing something else. They don't know that. That's not their world. Well, this is part of my world, and I'm just not convinced. So this bar chart to me is meaningless. I don't use them.
Okay, so we'll get to that in 1 second. But most people will look at the graph, and then they'll go right down to the recommendations on the bottom. But that's not necessarily going to give you a full picture because it just sort of takes in a standard approach to nutrient supplementation without really any other consideration other than, hey, we've established these guidelines for turf, so here's what we're going to do.
Well, that's probably true. They did use guidelines for nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. There are some guidelines for that. But I do agree with him that when you jump down to the recommendations and you start fertilizing your turf based upon the recommendations on a soil test, they can be useful for liming the soil or for acidifying the soil. I have some confidence in those values if it's actually necessary, which I would argue it's probably not necessary to adjust the soil pH, except for in extreme situations. But that can be valuable. But when it comes to particularly nitrogen, do not follow the nitrogen recommendations on a soil test report. And I'll give you a very clear explanation as to why. One, nitrogen on a soil test, with the exception of ion exchange membranes and some cool season grasses, nitrogen fluctuates so fast and so much that there's really no correlation between what the nitrogen would show up on a Mehlich 3 soil test and what you would see in turfgrass. There's no correlation there because it's just so variable. It changes so quickly. So pretty much the consensus of soil scientists would say nitrogen on a normal extractable soil test is not useful. I think that's pretty much this consensus across any reputable soil scientist would say that. Like I said, there is a little bit in some other types of soil tests that can be teased out, but I don't know if we're really there yet. So nitrogen, don't use it, but they put it on there anyway. And at some of the universities that I've worked with, I've begged them to remove that and instead put in a link to the extension publication that does provide the nitrogen recommendations for 2 reasons. One, the extension publications oftentimes include the law. So in cases, let's say Florida, where there's an urban turf rule and you have to follow certain applications of nitrogen based upon where you live, that can be an extension publication. So you might be recommending, the soil test report might be recommending a nitrogen application that might be illegal based upon where you live. But the extension publications are more current. So that's one reason why I say follow the extension publications. And the second reason is that the extension publications are published by the faculty, and those extension publications are often a result of work that has been conducted, a correlation and a calibration, well, not so much correlation, but a calibration on nitrogen on this turf in this location. And the examples of that are things like the nitrogen rate required for acceptable bahia grass in South Florida, which is one of the publications we published in Florida, or nitrogen rate required for acceptable centipede grass, nitrogen recommendations for acceptable St. Augustine grass. These are all referee publications. This was in Florida when I was working there. These are all referee publications that give you very precise, local to the location in Florida, nitrogen recommendations that were likely to result in an acceptable stand. But those don't get published on a soil test report. So the short and skinny of it is, don't follow nitrogen recommendation on a soil test report. And if they're presenting that and they're saying, oh, you should apply 3 pounds in or 4 pounds in, ignore it on a soil test report. Call the Land Grant University soil test turfgrass specialist and ask them, look at the extension publications through the university and see what nitrogen rates they're recommending. Because almost all extension turfgrass faculty will have publications on what they recommend in terms of nitrogen recommendations. North Florida has far lower nitrogen recommendations than South Florida, for example. Okay, so please do that instead of using a soil test report to apply nitrogen. When it comes to the other recommendations, phosphorus, potassium, and all these other recommendations, that requires a calibration. And I highly doubt, I'm very skeptical that any of these labs have gone out and conducted a calibration on potassium applications on Bermuda grass in southern Georgia or North Texas or wherever. That requires a calibration and to have any confidence in that recommendation. And I don't think any of that's been done. Well, I shouldn't say any, but very little of that has ever been conducted. So I agree with him on that. I wouldn't go to the recommendations at the bottom in terms of knowing or using that to apply certain amounts of fertilizer. Okay. I'd go to the extension publications from the faculty at the universities. That's what I would do.
So we're going to dig in a little bit differently. And I always go down like this. Just as the list is on this spectrum sheet here, you always look at pH first. I always go to organic matter, and I always do CEC. So it's top 3. I just want to see those items right out of the gate.
Yeah, well, I agree with soil pH, but William Albrecht wouldn't. The one who started base kind saturation, soil pH is not that important for plant growth. Okay, so pH is immensely important for plant growth. It's probably the most influential factor in soils for plant growth. However, just because your soil pH is 7.3 like it is on this test doesn't mean you should go out and start throwing out acidifying elements. As you can look at the past episodes I've gone over on soil pH, have clearly shown that if you want to start moving soil pH, you need to know what element is deficient. If it's nitrogen that's deficient, then don't move it from 7, because nitrogen mineralization occurs greatest at 7. But if phosphorus is deficient, then you might want to acidify it down. Okay, so there's a lot of moving pieces here. At the end of the day, what if the turf grass is growing well at that pH? Then that pH is fine. Okay, as we showed the other day with Dr. Grotall's picture on centipede grass at 4.0. Even at 4.0, the lab would not recommend liming centipede grass. She had to go out and actually show that you need to lime it up to 5 or 6 so the turf grass can grow to an acceptable level. Those are good reasons. But just because the pH is a 5.5 or a 6 or whatever it is doesn't mean you should go out and start throwing out lime. There's more to it than that. So it is important. What I'm saying is it is important. But in this one, it says 7.3 and optimal 6 to 6.8. And so if you read that literally, you go, well, I'm above the 6.8 and I need to start applying ammonium sulfate or sulfur to lower it back down. And the question is why? Who cares? If your turf grass is fine, it's fine. Don't try to start throwing things out of whack because you think the pH needs to be exactly 6.3 or 6.5. Okay?
And the reason that there's an importance to the listing of that is soil pH has to be corrected before you can do any other nutrient supplementation and get a good effect.
That's absolutely not true at all. That's one of the silliest things I've ever heard in my life. Potassium has very little pH. Soil pH has very little effect on extractable potassium between say 4 and about 8. Okay, potassium extractability is extremely consistent from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, and then when you get up into even to 8, when you get above 8. Then, which is unlikely, you're talking about less than 1% of the soils or 2% of the soils that you'd have come in are above 8 or 8.3. So 98% of the soils that you deal with are not going to be, the soil pH is not going to greatly affect extractable potassium. So when he says you have to correct soil pH in order to have to have the nutrients you apply have an effect is completely wrong with some nutrients. With other nutrients, there may be a benefit to moving the pH slightly. But he's stuck in that graph. His mind he's been delusional about that graph when it talks about the solubility of nutrients changing, but based on the soil pH, and then the nutrient solubility will change based upon soil pH. But that does not necessarily mean that there'll be greater nutrient uptake of that element. There, as I showed on those old episodes, the solubility of some elements might go up, but the uptake in the plant might go down, and vice versa. Solubility might go down, but the uptake might go up. Okay. And there's very clear examples of that in the literature that I went over on those 2 episodes, probably 2 or 3 months ago. So pH is important, but to say that you need to do it first before nutrient uptake can occur or nutrient efficiency uptake can occur or whatever is just not accurate.
Okay, so make that number 1. Number 1 is pH. So on here, just looking at yours and this in your front yard, 7.3 pH. Okay, so
I would make it number 1 if the turf grass was unacceptable and you were convinced it was a result of low soil pH or high soil pH. If your pH was 9, 9.5, or something crazy high, or 3, it's very likely that could cause what you're looking at in the turf, but not always. As we showed with the Sartain paper on Monday morning, it was 3.5 pH, and that's the pH that the Bermuda grass grew best at, because there was no appreciable amounts of aluminum or manganese in the soil to become soluble and to become toxic at that pH. Okay, so there's a lot more to it than just looking at it and going, oh, yeah, I gotta move the pH.
Maybe a little high in this particular
Wait, what do you say? What do you say was high?
High front yard, 7.3 pH. Okay, so maybe a little high in this particular soil. Like as I cruise down to the CECs, this says 19.1. So you're going to be moving into that clay loam area, which is great. Smaller particle. Obviously, you're in Iowa, so you've got, the old grasslands that were out there. Probably your lawn was prior farmland at one point, so it's been tilled and nurtured and was topsoil to begin with.
He's probably right about that. Those old molsols that are extremely fertile. But the point is, they're extremely fertile. You probably don't need to apply hardly anything. Just nitrogen, you'd be fine. As Rich, the lawn guy, says, you can probably just apply nitrogen there and you'd be perfectly fine. And he's probably right. So, but I don't get overly, when he's talking about CEC, there is clearly a relationship between CEC and the type of soil you're dealing with, but not always. Just make that clear. You can have a CEC of 16, 15, 16 and have it be a clay, loamy soil or not. Okay, you can have a very low CEC and have it be sand. That's correct. But you can also have a very sandy, lighter soil and have a high CEC, depending on a number of factors, including organic matter and all sorts of amendments that you might have applied. So I don't get overly concerned about CEC. It's just more of a means to, CEC being the cation exchange capacity, the ability of the soil to retain cations like magnesium and calcium. But it gives you an idea of what I look at it as like the buffering capacity of any potential future deficiencies. If something strange happens and not you unknowingly apply a bunch of potassium because you think you're going to reduce the stress, and your magnesium is right at that 20, 30 parts per million range, omega-3, and you throw a bunch of potassium out there, nothing was wrong. But then all that potassium knocks off the magnesium, and now you've moved yourself into magnesium deficiency because the soil's ability to retain magnesium was very low in a low CEC soil. That might not happen in a high CEC soil. So I would look at it like that, but I wouldn't look at CEC and then, well, there's no reputable soil scientist that would ever look at CEC and go, yes, that's a clay. Okay, there's ways to diagnose and to categorize that soil, and none of it has to do with the CEC. The sand, silt, and clay, and the type of soil it is has to do with hydrometers, and you could sift things out. There's all sorts of different ways you can do it, but it's not based on the CEC.
So just running through those items, we'd want to look at a soil pH correction.
Yeah, no. 7.3, and you're going to see Ryan's lawn here in a minute. It's almost as perfect. It's virtually the most perfect lawn I've ever seen in my life. So why do you want to go out and adjust the pH at a 7.3 or the CEC or whatever? It's just absurd. It's the only word. It's asinine. So don't waste money if following these recommendations from someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay.
And we can check that. So let's take a look at this 7.3, and I'm going to go down to the graphs across the bottom. And so sulfur would be how we would adjust that. And you can see on the graph that sulfur is in the medium to low range. So that's an identifier right there. Calcium being high, that's causing your pH to be high.
No, you can't say that. Calcium, I've said this before. I'm going to pull my hair out before this episode's over. Oh, Lord. Okay. When soil pH moves up, extractable calcium will also increase. That is true. But calcium alone does not increase soil pH. When you apply lime, or you apply any sort of dolomite or lime or anything that would move the pH up, it is not a result of the calcium only. Calcium, all calcium does is going to remove hydrogen and aluminum that's on the cation exchange site and move it into solution. It's the carbonate in lime that binds with the hydrogen or binds with the aluminum. Okay? It's the carbonate that moves the pH up, not the calcium. Thanks, Tom G. It's the carbonate. There is a confusion between, the calcium's high and that's causing the pH to go up. No, it is not how it works. There is an association between high pH and high calcium, yes. But just because the calcium is high does not necessarily mean that's what's causing the pH to go up. And he said something about sulfur. This sulfur on the test, just so we can see here, this sulfur here that he's talking about, that is Malic 3 sulfur. He's talking about this sulfur, I guess, being medium or low. I don't want to misquote him. Let me see if I can play it back and make sure I understand what he's saying here.
Across the bottom, and so sulfur would be how we would adjust that. And you can see on the graph that sulfur is in the medium to low range.
Yeah, so I think if I can interpret what he's saying correctly, and I apologize to John if I'm misinterpreting what he's saying. I think what he's saying is because the sulfur is low on this test and the calcium is high, that sort of dynamic is why the pH is high. The sulfur on this test is not just elemental sulfur. It's probably almost no elemental sulfur. The Malic 3 extract extracts sulfate and probably sulfur. And when it burns it in the plasma flame, it's going to burn all forms of sulfur. If there's any organic material in there, there's any sulfate, sulfur, and the majority of sulfur in the soil, in arable soils at least, is going to be in the sulfate form because it's going to oxidize. That's what happens when you apply elemental sulfur to a soil to acidify it. It oxidizes, becomes sulfate, and that process results in sulfuric acid. That's why the pH goes down. But the sulfur on this test is not going to be related to the pH because it's not sulfur, it's sulfate sulfur. So I don't know if that's what he's saying. Don't want to misinterpret him, but I think that's what he's saying, which again, if that's true, he's confused.
So that's an identifier right there. Calcium being high, that's causing your pH to be high.
Again, no,
so we
not
need
necessarily.
to adjust from that standpoint. So that's the first thing. We're going to look at correcting the pH, and then we just keep cruising down. Your organic matter is in a great level. The buffering capacity of your soil based on a 3.2% is fantastic. What you can throw at it, the soil is going to use very well. It's going to store very well, and it's going to hold water in a good way without being too saturated. So that's actually a really good number. It's probably giving you about 45 to 60 pounds of free nitrogen a year just on decay and cycling at a 3.2%.
You can't really say that, but I mean, he's probably in the ballpark. You can't just look at an organic matter and say it's probably doing this. There's a process that you have to actually measure that and determine how much is actually being mineralized. But what he's saying is because the organic matter is 3.2, there's going to be some nitrogen mineralized from that and provide that to your turfgrass for free, which I agree with. He's correct about that. But the amount, I should have done the math on that before I started the show tonight or today, and I would have been able to give you a number of whether or not his number is accurate or not. But yeah, what he's saying is basically correct on that issue.
Organic matter.
Okay.
And then we would get into like the base saturations, and that's where it starts to get a little bit different as far as when I'm looking at things compared to, with these recommendations that you have here. So green bar on the right, where you've got sort of the optimum ranges that are recommended based on your soil type. So that bar can actually change depending on the soil type and the area of the country you're in.
Oh, Jesus freaking Christ on a cracker. This is going to drive me insane. Okay. What he's saying is that the optimal range in the green bar is going to change based on soil type. So the ranges that you should fall within will change based on soil type. Completely inaccurate. The Mehlich 3 minimum critical minimum is going to be the same regardless. Okay, the amount that gets extracted will differ. But if let's just all agree that, let's say the Mehlich 3, he was on base cation saturation. So let's say the Mehlich 3 potassium, let's just agree it needs to be 40 parts per million Mehlich 3. The critical limit's not going to change. The base cation saturation ranges aren't going to change. The amount that gets extracted will change, but the limit isn't. You either have enough in the soil determined through an extraction or you don't. Okay, and that enough is, let's just say it's 40 parts per million Mehlich 3. Doesn't matter whether it's a clay, doesn't matter whether it's a sand, a loam, or organic soil, it doesn't make any difference. You either have that amount of extractable K or you don't. Okay?
You'll see these numbers fluctuate. So if they have a recommendation of phos of 40 to 70 parts per million on here, that might look different in another area just because of the soil type. So
no, it won't. It might look different based on the soil test lab. They can put whatever number there they want, 40 to 70. And that 40 to 70 is the number that comes from a correlation. And what I'm saying is that I doubt this lab or many other labs, including many university labs, have actually done the correlations to determine what that critical limit is. Clearly, there's been some done. Kentucky's been done. Florida's been done. I think Wisconsin's been done. Auburn. There's correlations that have been conducted. And those soil test reports generally will use the correlations, the critical limit. But this 40 to 70, it's only going to change based upon the lab. If you do a lab up in New York or California or Florida, those labs can put whatever range they want on there. What I'm saying is, if you follow the faculty's publications, those aren't going to change unless there's another new correlation come in, a more accurate or more precise or whatever. Those are going to be the same. That's the reason I'm saying go to Land-Grant University's extension websites or call the specialists at those universities and have them tell you what is the critical limit for magnesium in Florida soils. Well, there's a publication on that. What's the critical limit for phosphorus in Wisconsin soils or Pennsylvania soils on turfgrass? There's data on those. Okay, so you don't need to follow base cation saturation full stop. But in this case, he's looking at the phosphorus, Mehlich 3, and he's saying the 40 to 70 over here. He's saying this will change, and it will not unless the lab's just completely ignorant and flawed. It's going to be what it is until you change labs. Okay, let's go back.
That's something to pay attention to. But anyway, the base saturation area where that's talking about potassium, magnesium, calcium, salt are what they are reading in that area to give you a total soil solution.
What? Salt? Is that what he said? Salt? Let me rewind it. The base cation saturation is measuring salt?
Talking about potassium, magnesium, calcium, salt are what they are reading.
I think he saw sodium here, sodium saturation. I think he conflated that with salt. I think that's what he's doing. Whether he's conflating that with salt or whether he's saying that all these values are a result of the salt, either way, he's wrong. Base cation saturation, all it is a measure of the CEC, the cation exchange capacity of the soil, and how many of those sites are occupied by the cations down here, which are potassium, magnesium, calcium. So we're using these values, 211, 483, and 4,198. They're using these values along with, they don't have the sodium value on here. They're using these values along with the CEC, and they're determining how much of that is occupied by the various cations. That's all that is. It's not salt.
In that area to give you a total soil solution number. Your K saturation is in a good line there between 2 and 4%. That's great.
I don't care.
Magnesium also in a good zone there. At 18.6 is 10 to 20. Calcium again is high. So we can equate that back down to the bars on the bottom. We see that calcium is high and we see that sulfur is low. So we know that we're going to utilize sulfur to bring that calcium level down, sort of use it a little bit, because that's also affecting your pH.
Yeah, no, it's not affecting pH. It's not resulting in a high pH. It might be affecting the pH depending on what's in there. But you don't need to worry about calcium saturation. That's complete nonsense and BS. And this is the way the salesmen use it. They sound very convincing, very compelling. Oh yeah, okay, that's high. It's above that range, so I should listen to him. Don't do that.
Then it sort of gets into general recommendations. Now, when you sent me this and looked it over, when I first looked it over, I ran through just to see what was showing up as far as available nutrients in the soil. Your phosphorus is...
Soil tests don't report available nutrients. I'm tired of even saying this. It drives me insane. Soil tests do not report available nutrients. It's just soluble or extractable. Okay? Not available.
High. Now, typically I see that
what is
high.
What is high?
Going up as far as available nutrients in the soil. Your phosphorus is high. Now, typically I see that
phosphorus on those listing, phosphorus is 100 Mehlich 3 parts per million. He's saying it's high because the range is 40 to 70. What I would say is, don't worry about it. It's 100 parts per million Mehlich 3. It would be high if you're concerned about environmental risk in terms of runoff, phosphorus runoff. There's not a lot. There is some relationship between the Mehlich 3 extractable phosphorus and runoff, but not very good. There's a couple of publications on that. It's not great to use that to determine or predict what might be an environmental risk. However, what I would interpret that as saying, okay, you got 100 parts per million Mehlich 3 phosphorus. You probably don't need to apply phosphorus at all, even if you remove the turfgrass tissue for a decade or more. There's no need to apply it. Okay, so if he's saying high in that regard, then he's correct.
On lawns that have been using either starter fertilizer a lot or a biosolid, because biosolids, if you put out full rates, you're getting a significant amount of phosphorus. Do either of those apply to you?
Yeah, that's probably true in many cases where people have been following poor recommendations on YouTube to apply natural organics, and they think it's safe and good to apply natural products. What they don't realize is that when you apply a natural product based upon the rate of nitrogen, and you apply half a pound or a pound in on the nitrogen rate, you're applying well in excess of anything you'd ever need in phosphorus. And on top of that, you might not even need to apply any phosphorus at all. And over time, that can build up. And I have several episodes on that specific issue as the long-term effect of natural organics being applied to soil and the phosphorus buildup that can result from that. So he's right about that.
Yeah, so with the renovations that I've done over the last few years, that's pretty typical. I would have probably had starter on there, and we're also using a lot of malorganite in the past, so that's kind of exactly where I think that comes from.
Yeah, so you've got a lot. You've got a lot in the soil, and you will not need to apply any phosphorus.
He's right about that.
So you can just take that out. We're going to go ahead and remove that from your program.
I agree.
If we're moving across, now we'll go into potassium. Potassium's actually in pretty good shape, but that's one that you can lose out on. So you want to make sure.
Let me stop this here. For those listening, the range that he said will change. It'll change based on soil type. Is 200 to 310 on this. This is the reason you don't want to follow these recommendations or these interpretations on many soil test report. They're interpreting potassium, the Mehlich 3 parts per million in parts per million of 200, or I guess less than 200 as being below the range. Okay, so they're saying the potassium should be between 200 and 310. You will almost never see a beneficial response to applying potassium in almost any situation. I mean, you have to get way, way low on potassium, like south of 40. You have to get down to the 30s or the 20s to see a beneficial response to applied potassium on turf grasses. And what this soil test report is saying is you have to have above 200. Don't do that. And he's saying the potassium's, what did he say? The potassium's pretty good or whatever. Yeah, again, you probably would never need to apply potassium for years on this soil. And you may be in a soil that has potassium-bearing minerals in there, and there's mineralization occurring from the minerals in the soil naturally. So you could be removing turf tissue at a 211 parts per million, which is where this soil test is. You could be removing turfgrass tissue, harvesting the potassium out of the soil, and it would never go down. if you had potassium-bearing minerals such as potassium feldspars in your soil. So there's a lot going on here that is necessary to understand before you just start looking at soil test numbers and going, yeah, I need to apply potassium, or I got plenty of potassium, or I don't have enough potassium. There's a lot more going on in the soil than just what you see on a soil test report.
You are getting enough K out throughout the season, it's not going to require much in order to maintain healthy turf. You'll really only need to put out maybe a pound, 1,000 throughout the year.
No, you do 200 parts per million Mehlich 3. You don't need to apply any potassium. I don't know how much more clear I can make it. 200 parts per million Mehlich 3 potassium. Your turf grass does not require any additional applications of potassium. And in fact, the application of excess potassium in those situations greatly increases the risk of some diseases, as I've shown on the channel in numerous publications. Okay? Do not do that. You have enough. Don't worry about it. At 200 parts per million Mehlich 3. I would say, honestly, if you have 40 to 50 parts per million Mehlich 3 potassium, you're probably fine. Even in cases where you might experience some winter kill, as long as you have 50-ish, I think the Schmidt paper, if someone can correct me, you may remember if you're listening, the Schmidt paper, I think they stated you needed 50 or 60 parts per million Mehlich 3 to minimize the risk of winter kill. So you're fine, even in cases where there is an environmental stress that would occur that would be reduced because of the application of potassium. Even then, it's not that much potassium that you need to apply.
Of potassium.
Okay.
Just in the level where you are right now, and it'll be fine, and that's something you can look at later on to see if you need to bump that up to another corrective level. Again, magnesium and calcium are a little bit high. We're going to buffer that down with sulfur because we're going to get the pH down, and then we'll start to see those other numbers move a little bit.
Well, magnesium and calcium are not high. How do you know they're high? I mean, how many times do I got to say the same thing over and over and over? The likelihood of calcium ever being a problem is almost zero. Same thing with magnesium. The excessive magnesium, this idea that you're going to tighten up the soil, you're going to have soil structural issues because you have high magnesium, it would only exist in the rarest of situations where you have no calcium, essentially. Calcium, if you're at 300 or 400 parts per million Mehlich 3 calcium, most of the literature would say you're fine. But there's literature that shows perfectly acceptable turf grass well below 300, 200, 300 parts per million Mehlich 3. Magnesium, you're looking at 20 to 40 parts per million magnesium. Anything greater than that, you're fine. Okay? Don't worry about it. So don't go in there and start throwing stuff at this situation thinking that there's a problem, when in reality, you're probably fine.
So we're just kind of working across the board. Sulfur, you're probably going to need about, I'd say a minimum 5 pounds would be good for the year, and you could split that up. It takes a long time for that to break down. So, you're not really going to be seeing pH major changes on that for like 60 to 90 days. It's going to take a while.
And that may be true. I don't know. I think what he's saying is applying sulfur for the pH, not for the sulfur. I didn't actually see the sulfur. Maybe they'll put the thing back up. I didn't see the sulfur, Mehlich 3 sulfur level on the report, but I may have missed it. I think he's talking about applying sulfur for pH reduction, which again, I wouldn't worry about at 7.3, and your turf grass looks perfect.
Okay.
But you can put safely on turf, especially in the springtime, you could put up to 5 pounds in one shot.
That's basically true. On some of the higher cut turf grasses, fescues, Bermudas and the roughs, things like that, you can go a little bit higher, maybe 10 pounds, but I don't see the point in that. Why risk it? Stay at about 5 pounds, and then you can do another 5 pounds, or just do 2 pounds and then do another 2 pounds later, and just stay a little safe. Because remember, when you apply that sulfur, you're creating sulfuric acid in the soil. Okay. So the creation of sulfuric acid can be extremely phytotoxic to turf grass, but the safe range, really less than 10, but I wouldn't even risk that. If you don't even need to apply sulfur full stop, but in this case, but if you wanted to, 2 to 5 pounds is probably safe. I agree. Most of the literature will say that. Thanks, Rich Long Guide. Sulfur was 16 parts per million. So if sulfur is 16 parts per million, it's unlikely that would be resulting in a deficiency. So he's probably talking about reducing pH.
That's about as much as you could put out at once per 1,000.
And we're
He's probably
talking
right about
about
that.
elemental sulfur.
Yes, elemental sulfur. Yeah. You have questions about that?
So is
So-
there any?
So this is why this video annoyed me so much, is because this guy on the screen, his name's Ryan Knorr. Correct me if I'm wrong. He seems to be genuinely interested in knowing what's true, what to do. He's. I don't know him. Maybe he's not. Maybe maybe he's the worst guy on the planet. But I get the impression from him he really does want to know. He wants to know what do I need to do? How can I use these numbers to help support my turf or whatever? He genuinely seems interested, and he's getting fed a load of BS from this guy. That's what annoys me. He's taking advantage of Mr. Knorr's, genuine, sincere approach to this.
Pretty much just a standard thing, like you can just go get somewhere, right?
Yeah, it's pretty common. Most garden stores, small lawn and garden centers carry it. And in ag land where you are, there's probably loads of it around. I think you could probably find it pretty simply.
Okay. And in terms of, with this being a little bit different for me too, with it being a low cut turf and I'm taking care of it slightly different than maybe a normal lawn, how would that play into things maybe with what I'm doing? Especially, is K probably still going to be pretty important in that part?
It is, yes. Okay, so when you start going into short mows, treating a lawn more like a golf green or even a fairway, you need to consider less nutrient more often.
Yeah, that may be true in sand-based root zones. That's what I've mentioned many times before.
Going to be your friend, but as far as stress goes, potassium and sulfur are going to be key to make sure that you have those in your program regularly so that you're eliminating stress.
Yeah, not on a soil that has a potassium malic 3 of 200. The potassium is very important, but you don't need to apply anymore. Like I mentioned, potassium will have an influence on stress. At 200 parts per million, you're applying more potassium. It's likely going to increase the stress. But people like this gentleman, Mr. Perry, don't bother reading the scientific literature, and they just spew a bunch of BS out and convince people you need to apply potassium for stress reduction. They don't, if they took, an hour a day or 30 minutes before they went to bed and read some scientific literature, they might be more versed on these issues and have a different opinion.
And I would recommend, if you can do it, potassium sulfate is great,
I
or
agree.
SOP. That's
Any response you see to potassium sulfate is almost certainly a result of the sulfate. Okay. Unless you have potassium so low, 20, 30 parts per million omega 3 or less, that you're actually seeing a potassium deficiency, the application of potassium sulfate any benefit would come from the sulfate, which is fine. The potassium sulfate, gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, and ammonium sulfate are the 3 least expensive sources to apply sulfate, depending on if you if you remove the amount of nitrogen that you're applying anyway and then you apply ammonium sulfate. If you balance out the nitrogen, ammonium sulfate can also be competitive in terms of sulfate applications, but potassium sulfate's fine.
a water soluble potash. You may be able to find that for $35 a bag or something at a turf supply place. That would be really good for you.
Okay.
And that's a simple 0050. It's easy to calculate out how many pounds you're going to put out. But you could run that on, say, 1/8 of a pound, or even as much as 1/4 of a pound a month, if you're going to be keeping it super low, and that'll really help with your summertime disease resistance and
you don't know that
turf recovery overall.
Yeah, I would say no. How do you know that? There's bukus of information in the literature that at 16 parts per million omega-3 sulfur, you're fine. There's not a lot of information on that, but at 16 parts per million, you're fine. You're not going to see any benefit to applying sulfate more than likely when you're that high. And you're certainly not going to see any beneficial response to applying potassium when you're 200 parts per million malic 3. I would challenge anyone to show me any refereed paper on the planet from Turfgrass, a reputable Turfgrass journal, that shows a beneficial response to applied potassium when the malic 3 is 200 parts per million. You're almost never going to see that. Okay. So there's no need to apply potassium sulfate according to these numbers and according to the way his lawn looks. There's no need. You're not going to see any benefit from that application.
And then as far as nitrogen goes in that situation, how much are you thinking per month would probably be pretty good?
So if you're going to go monthly, you probably will run. Now, I would recommend, based on your soil report, you probably run something like ammonium sulfate. Would be really good.
I don't have a problem with that. I mean, 7.3 pH, you can use ammonium sulfate. It's going to provide sulfate, so any benefit that would have come from the potassium sulfate will now be realized from the ammonium sulfate. So again, a further reason not to apply potassium sulfate. But at 7.3, you're probably fine using urea or ammonium sulfate. If anything, it's going to lower the pH down a little bit over time, but you're already at 7.3, you're probably fine. And ammonium sulfate has the additional value of applying sulfate that urea does not.
Because of the additional sulfur, it's going to help.
Holy Christ on a crack. What did he say?
Be really good. Because of the additional sulfur, it's going to help.
Holy Jesus. I want to make sure I understood him correctly.
You probably will run. Now, I would recommend, based on your soil report, you probably run something like ammonium sulfate. Would be really good. Because of the additional sulfur, it's going to help.
I think he's talking about sulfur from ammonium sulfate having the effect on pH. I think that's what he's talking about. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure what he's saying, what he's implying is use ammonium sulfate in this situation because of the additional sulfur. Did I read that correctly, guys and gals in the chat? He is completely off. I don't know where he gets this information from. Ammonium sulfate has a profound effect on the acidification of soils, but it has nothing to do with the sulfur in the ammonium sulfate. The sulfur in ammonium sulfate is sulfate sulfur. It's already been oxidized. I don't want to hit him hard if I'm misunderstanding him. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding him. But sulfur has to be elemental sulfur in order to have an effect on pH. Ammonium sulfate acidifies the soil because you're applying 8 hydrogen ions for every molecule of ammonium sulfate. You're directly adding hydrogen ions into the soil system. The sulfur in ammonium sulfate has nothing to do with it. Let me look at this again. I feel bad if I'm misunderstanding him.
So if you're going to go monthly, you probably will run. Now, I would recommend, based on your soil report, you probably run something like ammonium sulfate. Would be really good. Because of the additional sulfur, it's going to help. You could run between, if you're going to go every month.
That's what he's saying. He's saying the sulfur from ammonium sulfate. So I made it clear he's not accurate. He doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to how ammonium sulfate acidifies the soil. It's not from the sulfur. It's from the ammonium. Good morning, Rob.
A third pound, 3/8 of a pound per month.
Okay.
Would actually be pretty nice. You could go as much as a half pound, but I don't know if you'll need to go that high. That's going to end up giving you, you get 3 pounds. If you do it 6 times, how long's your season? 8 months?
Probably about 8, yeah.
I would start out running it with a half pound first and second month. Get a half pound out, and then maybe start to readjust that as time goes on, because you don't really want to be pushing a whole lot of growth. You want to keep it moving along pretty low. So, minors are going to be more important, and just keep your in level on the lower side of things.
Yeah, minors are not that important. Minors are important. The application of minors isn't going to result in any benefit, more than likely, so they're not important in that regard. Let me just mention on nitrogen, he's trying to figure out how to answer Ryan's question when I think he doesn't know the answer to it. When it comes to nitrogen applications, here's my recommendations to figure out how much nitrogen you need to apply. At your state, go to the university and pull up the extension publications, because those are going to be largely updated or more recent. And if there's any laws that restrict nitrogen applications in your state, they're going to account for that. So whether it's the rate of nitrogen or whether it's the time of year you can apply nitrogen, the extension bulletins and publications will account for those laws. So if you're in Texas or California or Florida or Georgia or wherever it is, you can't just say, oh, do this, because in your state it might be illegal. So I would go to the university, find the publications on nitrogen applications to, whatever, Bahia grass or St. Augustine grass, find it. And then you're going to see some ranges. Those ranges are instituted for a very specific reason, which I can go into later. But there's a range, let's say 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen. I would look at that and say that's the total amount for the year that I need to apply, that I am allowed to apply, 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen. Let's just say that. And then at your location, on your golf course or your sod farm or your lawn or whatever, I would self-calibrate. I would be putting out for the growing season, let's say your growing season is 6 months. I would be putting out, and you say I want to apply nitrogen every 2 months versus say I want to apply nitrogen every 1 month or whatever. I would take that growing season and I would divide the number of months by the total amount of nitrogen that you can apply, or the other way around. So you know how much nitrogen you can apply each month. And then say you're applying nitrogen at 0.5 pound a month for 6 months. That's 3 pounds a year. And you realize, I'm mowing the grass every week. I don't want to do this. I can't keep up with it. Then you can self-calibrate that and move the nitrogen rate down a little bit for the following season or the end of the season you're in now. But you start with the ranges from the university, so because those are probably going to be legal to apply. They will be legal to apply. And then within those ranges, you can fidget with the numbers up or down monthly or bi-monthly, however you want to do it, such that you can meet the expectations that you're looking for, the growth rate or the quality or whatever it might be at your home or on your golf course. Okay. Don't go by somebody saying this stuff on YouTube. Okay. Don't follow those recommendations because they could be completely illegal in your situation. Don't do that. Just go to the university, get the ranges, and then adjust it up or down slightly within those ranges to meet your expectations at your location. That's my recommendation.
Thanks.
Okay. And is there anything different there in terms of the foliar feeding that, we obviously, the grass is still in the soil, so it matters, but in terms of feeding it through the leaf versus, is that any different or play into it in any way?
Oh, Lord. This will be good. Before I forget, that question has something to do with Randy's question yesterday about, I don't know if you sent me an email, Randy, or if you put it in the chat about biuret urea and the potential for burning as foliar. I looked that up, and there's not a lot of information on that, but we'll see what biuret can be toxic depending on a number of factors. But there's not a lot of information in the turfgrass literature, but it has to do with foliar applications, not granular applications. And so let's see what he says about the difference between foliar and granular application.
So you have to think about it this way. It's all about surface area, right? So if you're cutting grass really super short, you've got a lot less surface area to adhere to as far as foliar goes, but that doesn't really matter. The grass is only picking up a percentage of that anyway. The rest of it's getting pushed down into the soil, and it's going to be uptaken through soil conversion and roots no matter what. So it doesn't really make a difference. You'll get sort of when you foliar versus just strictly granular feed, you'll get a little bit quicker visual response just because you're seeing that directly into the plant. But then whatever's left over is going to be pushed down into the soil for soil use. So it all works the same.
Okay.
I'm not going to hit him too hard on that either. For the most part, he's in the ballpark. The application of nitrogen in foliar form has been shown to be most effective as urea. And the concept behind that is because urea is not charged, as opposed to ammonium or nitrate being applied to the leaves, where they are positively and negatively charged, respectively. Urea may have a little bit more, it may be a little easier to facilitate the uptake of a non-charged nitrogen source like urea than it would a charged source. That's the general concept behind it. Arkansas did some work on that, and I wouldn't say that's a slam dunk, but I do have some confidence in that position because of the research that's been applied. In my opinion, the value of granular nitrogen applications, since they brought it up, the value of granular nitrogen applications is the cost and the potential longevity of release. So you're almost never going to find a less expensive way to apply nitrogen in a foliar form as you would from a similar form in granular form, or similar rate in granular form. So if you're applying urea in a granular form, it's going to be a little safer You can also apply slow release nitrogen sources as a granular form as opposed to foliar applications. Foliar applications have to be a much lower rate and more frequently because the burn potential is quite high. However, with the advantage of foliar is that you can really dial it in really tight. So golf courses are applying weekly applications on their putting greens because they want to have more control over that. But most home lawns, granular applications of nitrogen are going to be less expensive and going to result in a perfectly acceptable lawn it's fine. But if you really want to control everything and you want to make sure you know exactly how much is going on and you're going to put out a 0.1 or 0.2 pounds in from urea or whatever source as a foliar, you could do that too. And you're probably going to avoid some of the ebbs and flows of the turf quality going up and down by using a foliar application of urea as opposed to a soluble granular application of urea. But in terms of turf quality, it just depends on how you want to slice that cake. I don't have enough energy or interest to put out foliar applications. I just put out granular application and I'm fine. But if, it wouldn't shock me if some of the people listening who really want a really perfect lawn would find that they can do that more efficiently as a foliar application, then that's fine. And the further benefit of foliar is that you can include things like iron that can be useful as a foliar application, whereas that iron cannot be really useful as a granular application. So there's values both ways depending on what you're how much effort you're willing to put into it and how much money and what your expectations are.
Yeah, just sort of speed of uptake, I guess.
Okay.
Well, that's true. The speed of uptake, or the speed of, I wouldn't say uptake, I would say the speed of response is probably almost always actually greater with a foliar application. You'll see a response in a day or two. Granular applications require a little bit of soil up, moving into the soil and then being taken up by the roots and then move up into the leaves, whereas urea or nitrogen applied to the leaves is right there. So that's probably true.
So then I know we talked a little at Lawncology kind of about the recommendations down below. If sometimes that seems to be a very general thing. So maybe you, for people looking at that part, they kind of want to just kind of know that that's sometimes just more of a general look at things.
Yes. Now, it is. In a lot of cases, the recommendations are based off of just the sort of land-grant university recommendations. So what you're going to see...
Well, yeah, I would hope so. I mean, yeah, I agree. Now, on this particular test, coming from this particular lab, I doubt it. Because there's land-grant recommendations that don't even exist on that land-grant soil test report within the same university. Perfect example is going on right now here in Kentucky. We don't recommend the use of base cation saturation at all. There's no evidence to support that the use of the application of nutrients following base cation saturation, but it's on the soil test report at University of Kentucky now. So I would hope they'd follow university specialist recommendations, but not always. Certainly not on the soil test report doesn't mean that it's doing that.
In general, on a soil report is 4 pounds of nitrogen recommended annually, 1 to 2 pounds of phos, and 1 to 2 pounds of potassium.
That's probably true. Yeah, he's probably right about that. They just apply 4 and 1 and 2, or 4 and 2, or whatever the case is. And what I've said many times, I wouldn't follow recommendations on that. If that's where he's going, I don't know where he's going with this. If that's where he's going, I wouldn't really follow these recommendations. I'm in complete agreement with that. I would look at those and if as long as they say, refer to this extension publication, then I would go to the extension publication and follow those. But I wouldn't follow these recommendations because that requires, as I said, a calibration. And I doubt this soil test report includes recommendations based upon a calibration.
That's pretty general. And some labs, if they see something that's got they do a nitrate test, they do all this stuff, you'll see an adjustment on the nitrogen levels. That those nitrogen recommendations might be lower. So that can happen. You'll see the phosphorus and potassium change a little bit if there's a major discrepancy. But you'll also see, in general, there's a recommendation for a fertilizer, whether it's a 15 or whatever that might be, and it'll just say apply 5.5 pounds of this per 1,000.
Yeah.
4 times a year.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really get you into anything else. It's just sort of measuring your big three NPK. So
yeah, that's true. He's right about that. Sometimes I'll see that too. 5 pounds of 10, 10, 10 or 15, 15, 15. Please don't do that. Okay. If you happen to need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, then do that. But in many cases, in this particular case where there's no need to apply phosphorus at all, there's no need to apply potassium at all, then just apply straight nitrogen. If the potassium's low, then apply nitrogen and potassium. If the potassium's fine but the phosphorus is low and so forth, apply just nitrogen and phosphorus. But the sort of the unilateral application of just N, P, and K, 5 pounds of this, 10 pounds of 10, whatever the case is, I really wouldn't recommend following that. And the reason is because you're wasting a lot of money and a lot of resources buying phosphorus and potassium when you're almost certainly never going to see a response to that, at least in this situation on this test. And if you're an environmentalist, you're applying phosphorus in a situation where none is needed. Turfgrass is probably never going to respond to that in this situation. And that's an element of potential environmental impairment.
That's all well and good, but if you don't do the adjustments with the other minors or any other limiting piece on there, you're never going to get the full value of that material to give you like an epic lawn. You're just sort of giving it a keeping alive look if you just follow those basic recommendations.
I disagree. I mean, if you follow the recommendations on that soil test report, you're probably going to have far more than you'd ever need. Your lawn is not going to be limited by the nutrients that you apply. That I'll say that much. If anything, you're going to have some excess potassium that might cause a stress. Okay, but you're not going to, the quality of your lawn is not going to be inhibited because you follow that recommendation. You're going to be, the point is you're going to be applying too much. That's my take on it. It's not that you're going to not be applying enough. You'll be applying more than enough. So nutrients won't be limiting. The ability of your lawn to achieve at a very, very high level would be a result of something else, like the type of mower that you're using or the amount or quality of water that you're applying, those sorts of things.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think going back all the way to the first part of our conversation there about looking at a test and not freaking out is, I mean, I'm looking at my lawn out here out the window.
And look at this thing. I mean, come on. You would be hard pressed to find golf course approaches that look that good. Find me a tee box that looks better than Ryan Knorr's front lawn. It's going to be a long time. You're going to be looking for a long time to find something better looking than that. And you're telling me you need to be applying potassium to that lawn, or phosphorus to that lawn, or micronutrients to that lawn? On a soil test, on a lawn that looks like this, and I'm assuming he doesn't have any pre-existing conditions, and he might. I don't know. But assuming he doesn't have any pre-existing conditions, his lawn looks freaking fantastic. You don't just get a good mower, which clearly he does. He's striping it up. Get a good mower, have a good water regime, apply some nitrogen, maybe a little foliar iron here and there, and you're going to be fine. Applying all this other stuff, applying sulfur to move it down and move the calcium down and move the sulfur up and move the pH down and applying, it's madness. Yeah, it's absolute madness. His lawn is as I can't say because I'm not standing on it, but from a distance on this video, it is as close to a 9 as you could possibly get. I mean, if I went out there and looked at it, maybe it's not quite so dense. I don't know. But on YouTube, it's a 9. You're not going to get much better than that. So good job, Mr. Knorr. Looks good. I don't know why you'd need to follow the recommendations from this guy applying stuff to lower your pH.
Obviously, it still looks very good. So
yeah, no joke. Look at that thing. He may have some little, I don't know what this, little holes here. I don't know if he took some soil samples out or maybe he had some little area he removed some sod plugs or something. But it looks great. Just keep doing what you're doing. You could probably remove stuff from it from your nutrient program rather than adding stuff to it. Looks fine. I mean, maybe it didn't look fine to him. I don't know what his take on it is. Well, he just said it looks fine. Well, let's see what he said. He said it obviously looks great.
It still looks very good.
Very good. So that's his opinion. Looks great. I agree. Don't need to throw a bunch of stuff at it right now to try to move pH and calcium and sulfur and all this other stuff. It's silly, wasteful.
Considering that it's a 7.3 and that, yes, I can improve some things, it kind of goes back to the fact that you don't need to freak out too much because I'm looking at a very nice set of turf out there. I can maybe just make it a touch better and improve things, that way.
You probably could, but it's not going to come from applying potassium. It's not going to come from moving the pH down from 7.3 when starting at 7.3. It might be a little bit, I don't know what kind of mower you're using. A lot of the quality can come from the type of cut that you have on your mower, how many blades you have on your mower, the height of cut you're cutting it at, rolling it, top dressing it, all these other things that have nothing to do with nutrients, really. It has to do with water or light or temperature or damage, the disease, that triangle that I use that someone put up here. Randy put it up here earlier as a emoji. If you start from the bottom of that foundation up, you're probably going to move it from really, really, really good to great. I would say that's great already, but I doubt you would ever see a bump in quality from where you're at now, Mr. Knorr, to where maybe a little bit finer by lowering the pH and applying sulfur and applying, whatever he's saying to apply. Nutrients are not your limiting factor, is my point.
Yes. Yeah. And that's really all it's going to do is you're going to increase efficiency overall. So, you'll see your grass growing more even. You'll see the color stay longer. You'll see less hot spots. You'll see less weeds. I mean, a lot of this stuff goes to weeds.
Okay, so he's made a lot of claims that can be measured. That's what I like. I like truth claims that are not ambiguous. They say more color, less weeds. All these things can be measured. And that's what we do in science. We can go and measure those. We can put those as a hypothesis, go out and design a study and conduct it and see what happens. And when we do, volume-based cation saturation isn't going to have any effect on weeds. It isn't going to have any effect on the uniformity of color or the longevity of color, as he mentioned. Okay? So that is what it is.
To where if we're correcting these soil deficiencies, then we're not going to see as many weed issues pop up or fungus issues pop up or even insects.
What deficiency is he talking about? Did I miss something? I didn't see a deficiency on that test. Not in nutrients.
So, the stronger we can make the soil, the better chance we have of an overall health. So
well, true.
That's why you want to look at it. It's not just about making the grass green, because you can make grass green with just nitrogen. You could do that and just pound it. And you can always force out grass to be green, but it might not be as thick. And you might have a ton of dandelions. You might start getting crabgrass, but you still have green grass.
Yeah, see, that's what you got to do. You got to install some sort of fear in the client or the end user. There must be some sort of problem that you have to create. You can't just apply nitrogen because it'll be just, you'll have green grass, but it won't be as dense. How would that happen? How would you apply nitrogen, increase the color, increase the growth, but not increase the density? You're going to increase the density. That's what's going to happen. Okay. When nutrients are deficient, regardless of the nutrient, it could be boron. If it is indeed deficient, then it will require the application of that element in order to alleviate that deficiency. That's true. Okay. And there is clearly a relationship between some weed populations and some nutrient fertilizer regimes. That is true. But to say that you're going to have all these problems if you only apply nitrogen is fear-mongering. That's what it is. It's not based on reality.
Right? So this is going a step further of saying, hey, we're going to put in a little bit of this, and it's going to make such a compounding effort over time to reduce our needs on these other, herbicides and things like that. So that's how I see it.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, I don't know if any of that's true. He's saying you can adjust the soil and you're going to have less weeds and less disease. That's probably, if you have a healthy stand of turf grass, then it is going to have a great ability to resist, diseases and, weed pressure and all these things. All that's true. Insect damage and all that stuff. All that's true. And all that can be achieved, at least in the case of Mr. Knorr's lawn and his soil test, with just, sufficient but not excessive applications of nitrogen. And a little bit of color, you want some that, go ahead and apply some foliar iron. But throwing out a bunch of this other stuff doesn't seem, in my view, based upon what I'm seeing in his lawn and based upon what I saw in the soil test report, I don't see any value. I just see a lot of waste.
Okay, well, I think that pretty much covers things there. For those people just getting into this, it might seem a little overwhelming at first. It kind of did to me, but the more that I've looked at these tests, the more I've talked to you and talked to other people that have really been breaking it down for people. It's really making a lot of sense. So I think it just takes a little time to get it in through your head. But thank you very much, John. I really appreciate you going over this with me. And thanks very much.
Okay, and that's why I went over it. I'm so sorry for Mr. Knorr. He seems sincere. He seems genuinely interested in understanding it, learning more about it. And he's getting his information from someone who doesn't have really a clue what he's talking about when it comes to soils in turf grasses, unfortunately. And I don't know, this video is 5 years old. So maybe Mr. Knorr has since, adjusted how he does things, or maybe he's further convinced that what this gentleman's saying is correct. I don't know what his position is now. But when people start looking for information, looking for what's true, to go to YouTube is probably not wise, because how do you know? And I'm going to use an example here before I close off here, is that the question, how do you know the information is accurate or valid or evidence-based? How would you go find it? And I got a question yesterday from Randy. I think it was Randy who was asking me about biuret urea. And his question was, do I need to be concerned about the biuret content in spray-grade urea? Essentially, it's what he's asking. I don't know the answer to that question. So how do I go find information? How do I have confidence in information? What I do is I go straight to the Tri-Societies, agronomy or crops or soils.org, and I go to their publications, Crop Science or Agronomy Journal or whatever. I'm sorry. Okay, it wasn't Randy. It was somebody else. I apologize. I can't remember who it was. Somebody asked me this question yesterday. And I go to their journals, and I type in biuret, turfgrass, and I search for it, and exactly one article came up. Then I go to Google Scholar, and I type in biuret turfgrass, and exactly one article, well, more articles came up, but one article on turfgrass came up. Then I go to Turfgrass Information File, and I type in the search engine, biuret, because everything on Turfgrass Information File for Michigan State is going to have turfgrass papers only. Type in biuret, and the same paper came up. And it's from 1950-something or 40-something, I can't remember. So there's only one paper, okay? So I read that paper, and I see it's on coastal Bermuda grass, and I don't think they applied it foliar, they applied it as a granule. So it's not exactly what he was asking, but it's all we can go by. So I know that biuret can be a problem, but I can't really have much confidence in saying, you know what, your biuret and your foliar grade urea should be less than 2% or something, or you're going to have a problem. I can't say that with much confidence because I don't have any more information in the literature. I don't go to YouTube and do biuret urea and look for it. That's how I have confidence in the information that I receive. Is I'm asked a question I don't know the answer to, Turfgrass Information File or Google Scholar or Tri-Societies, and do a search on it. Do a literature review on it and see what you can find. That's how I gain knowledge and gain confidence on information. So in the case of soil testing, which is what this video is about, I don't know how to read soil tests. I don't know how to do this. That's how you feel. Well, I wouldn't go to YouTube to find out. You can go to YouTube to figure out how to bake a cake. Okay. Make a pizza. But when it comes to this is science. Call your land-grant university. Ask them. If they don't know, they'll send you in a different direction to find someone who does know. Or look it up on Tri-Societies. That's how I start vetting the information. And my confidence in the information is directly related to the evidence that supports it. And the evidence comes from the scientific literature. And right now, my confidence on biurea is very, very low. I don't have much confidence because there's not much evidence. That's how it works. Okay, but when you get to YouTube and you get this information thrown at you, if you don't have the governor inside you to detect BS, you're just going to receive the information of it as if it's true when you don't have the necessary knowledge to properly vet what is true versus what is BS versus what is lies, misinformation and disinformation. So please, do your best to vet the information. Don't just assume that it's true because, some salesman on YouTube sounds confident and sounds competent about the information. Okay. Thanks, Gray. Says Dr. Shaddox, try to stay calm after this nonsense. Yeah, I'm going to try to. It's, Valerio. Thank you. Yeah. Valerio asked me about the biuret. Thank you, Valerio. I apologize. I got confused. We have some international audience here, and sometimes I get confused. Thank you for speaking up, Valerio. You asked me about the biuret. So I'll send you an article, Valerio, if I have your email about that. But there's really not much information on it, just so you know. But there is some evidence that the biuret can be toxic to some plants at a high enough percentage applied to the leaves. There is a little bit of evidence there, but I can't tell you what it should be on turf grasses, unfortunately. Okay. Thanks all. We had a really good crowd tonight, 50-something people online watching this live. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back on Thursday night where we're going to be going over more base count and saturation stuff. And we're going over the most important base count and saturation paper in the last 100 years, probably, the Olson 82 paper. We might be there for a while. Might be a little dry, but it's really important to understand why base count and saturation. I have the opinion that it is invalid, it's not useful, and it's wasteful. And one of the main reasons is the Olson 82 paper, which I'll go over on Thursday night at 9 p.m. I look forward to seeing everybody there. Thanks so much. See ya.